as the language had it, revealed themselves. They were, in a sense, people whom others felt and they felt were singled out. And the Rebbe was the head of the community. And people within that community lived on the advice of the Rebbe. I mean, even ordinary, everyday decisions, but certainly significant decisions in people's lives were made by the Rebbe. Now, as I said, these communities began to exist in the 1700s and they changed in the 1800s. The amazing thing is, of course, is that they lasted into the 20th century and were going strong into the 21st. They went through an awful lot, especially during the Second World War, during the time of the Holocaust, and gradually some of these communities moved from Eastern Europe, and some came to America, and some are in Israel. The largest of these communities is called Chabad, and that's what the community that Chaim Potok talks about in this book is based on. If you went to New York and you crossed over into Brooklyn and you'd walk down Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, you'd find a world like this. That is, there's the headquarters of Chabad, and the Rebbe is there, and all kind of other institutions are there, and people like the people that you read about in your book are living there. Meanwhile, there are all kinds of other Jewish people who are neither Hasidim nor are they Orthodox. In fact, there's a Jewish community in Tacoma, there's a Jewish community in Seattle, and the people would describe themselves in these communities as Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. By that they mean that they take a certain attitude toward Jewish tradition. Most of those people would be non-Hasidim. Okay? Reform Jews, I'm a member of the Reform community, are people who are most radically at odds with Orthodoxy. That is, we follow people who a century plus ago decided that in order to adjust to modern life, Jews had to make certain changes in Jewish tradition. You recognize that all Jews had to do that. I mean, just like all people on earth had to change. And some people felt we went too far, and they're called conservative. And there are other people who tried to remain as true as they could to tradition in the modern world, and they're called Orthodox. But the Hasidim really represent the right wing of Orthodoxy. So their communities, to some extent, modernized. I mean, the Chabad Hasidim, who exist, by the way, in Seattle. You can go, if you want to, you can go up, 45th, where the University of Washington is, in the U District, and you'll come one of the cross streets there to the Chabad house. It's an old sorority house bought by the Chabad movement, and they have all kinds of things going on in that building. Oh, thank you. My goodness. Somebody gets to go someplace, right? Okay. Well, secret here. A secret document. A Valentine, yeah. Okay. Anyway, you'd see, and they have in North Seattle, they have a congregation, and they also have, further up in North Seattle, they have a school called a yeshiva, in which students come. Most of them are from different places in the world, actually, and they study Talmud there. It's a very small yeshiva, but we probably have 20, 25 students in Seattle who study every day. If you went in Seattle, you went south Seattle, you went to Seward Park, you'd be in the heart of what is the Orthodox community in Seattle. The thing you'd notice there is that most of the people look pretty much like everybody else. They dress like everybody else, whereas the people at the yeshiva or at the Hasidic congregation would, at least, if they didn't have earlocks, the men would all be wearing fringes, which would come out of the top of their trousers because they would wear them as an undergarment. The people there would always, the men would always wear some kind of head covering. The women in those communities, the very, very Orthodox ones, would be wearing wigs or would cover their heads with some kind of cloth or something. So and both would wear clothing that would cover as much as possible their bodies, especially the women. Well, let's see. Maybe I should answer your questions if we have to. Anyway, or you can ask me questions, or whichever way you want to do it. Oh, okay.
You said like the women wear wigs, and the book said that too, and you were spoken of. Why do you cover your heads?
Well, there are two different reasons why, one for men and one for women. Men cover their heads because for men, covering a head in Judaism became, at some point in history, we're not quite sure when, became a sign of reverence. It was a way of showing humility. One covered one's head. You know, you didn't. So that the idea was that an uncovered head was a sign of irreverence. Normally, people wear a skull cap, or you can wear a hat. This is a skull cap. Not a very high quality one, I'm afraid. But it's a skull cap, and you put it on the back of your head like that, see. So that's, for most Jews, that's used only in prayer or perhaps in study. In the 19th century, Orthodox people began to emphasize that one was always in God's presence, and so they covered their heads all the time. Men did. Women covered their heads for the same reason that you see pictures of Arab women, you know, on TV, or if you remember what nuns used to wear. Remember the old-fashioned habit the nuns wore, that these were ways that people showed modesty. To show one's hair, for example, the Talmud says that according to one authority, a man may divorce his wife if she goes out with her head uncovered in public. So that to show one's hair is lewd. You guys don't live through this, but I remember not too many years ago when hair was a big issue in America. You know that? People get excited about hair, the lack of it or too much of it, or hair in the wrong place at the wrong time. So in fact, we had a whole musical called Hair, you know, and it's hard to believe maybe that that's actually true, but that's what happened. I mean, people disowned their children, especially male children, if they had hair that was a little bit too long, right? They would get rid of them and say, get out of this house unless you get a haircut. Don't come back looking like that. So people have emotions about hair, and it wasn't the whole idea of lewdness. You know what lewdness is? Sexually provocative. Do you know what that is? Okay. What is sexually provocative? How do we know something is sexually provocative? Is there a dress code at Rogers? Could a person appear on this campus dressed in such a way that somebody in authority around here would say to them, go home and change your clothes? What would they have to wear to do that?
Short skirt.
A short skirt. How short would it have to be? Okay, it would have to be pretty short, right? I assume. So there's a limit. You know, every society has a limit. Our limits are very different from more traditional societies. More traditional societies felt that one should have public controls on human emotions, and that's how the whole idea about hair started. As people moved into the 20th century, well, the other thing I need to say is that when a man and a woman was married, she shaved her head and covered it, and then she was then never to uncover it again in public. I mean, that was 2,000 years ago and 1,000 years ago. In modern times, Orthodox Jewish women have worn wigs. I mean, which is sort of really strange if you think about it, is that the original idea that to show one's hair was replaced now simply by an idea that one should get rid of one's own hair, but it's perfectly okay to own somebody else's and put on your head. So those are really peculiar kinds of rules, but they are social and cultural signals people adopt, you see. They're ways that societies have of controlling people's behavior. That is, I mean, if you think about your rules again that govern your behavior in this school, both what is acceptable and what is borderline and what is not acceptable, you understand the kind of controls that the school or society wants to put on you. You can't do everything somebody who's running things says. But in different societies, the rules of what you can do and can't do and act and shouldn't act that way or wear or not wear change. Okay. Okay. Excuse me just a second. I'm losing my shoe here. Excuse my back, folks. Okay.
There are a lot of terms.
Oh, okay.
And so we've been defining
Okay.
some of these.
Should I just go down
You
or?
could do that, or we
okay.
did talk about some of this already. But,
Okay, okay.
This prayer, for example, you said
Okay.
tonight. And do you know that prayer?
Sure.
What does it mean?
Well,
Could you
prayer,
say it?
Shema is a sentence from Deuteronomy. You can look it up in the Bible, 6th chapter of Deuteronomy if you own a Bible. It's Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And it's followed by a paragraph which says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and so on. So some of you might know those words, right? Nobody's going to say for sure. In Hebrew, the first word here, the word here is Shema. The sentence in Hebrew is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God. The Lord is your God. The Lord is one. That sentence has become a central sentence in Judaism because of that word one, you see at the end of it. The unity of God, the singleness of God. Kriyas means simply saying the Shema. Shabbos is the same word as our English word Sabbath, right? The English word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbos, which comes from a Hebrew verb which means to rest. Yeshiva is a school, school where the main curriculum is the Talmud. It's a traditional Jewish school. Nowadays, the word yeshiva is used for usually two kinds of schools. There are yeshivas, which are more or less high schools, where young people your age go to study. There is such a yeshiva in Seattle, which is simply the high school of the Hebrew Academy, which is one of the Jewish day schools in Seattle. Then there is a yeshiva for adults, which is has a more advanced curriculum, and there are many, many yeshivas all over the United States and all over the world. Sitra Achra is a word that comes, two words actually, from what we call Kabbalah. I don't know, does the word Kabbalah ring a bell to anybody? Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism. It's a way of looking at life and at God and human relationships to God and to other people that was developed probably beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries and had a long history, and it is a kind of knowledge people seek to have in order to understand the unknown forces, the energies of human life, and to live in some relationship to them. The Sitra Achra, the easiest way to explain that would be, is the source of evil. It's not the same thing, but it's like someone says the devil, Satan, that is the absolutization of evil. It means literally the other side. I mean, the good side of life is God and the sources that come from God. The other side of life is the Sitra Achra. It's the counter forces. It envisions that human beings are, in a sense, always existing between two forces. One tugs at us to try to make us good, decent human beings, and the other one tries to force us to become the other side. The uniqueness of the idea of the Sitra Achra in Kabbalah and as it moved into Hasidism, unlike some of the ideas you run into about Satan or the devil, is that, according to the Kabbalists, the Sitra Achra is really a piece of God that has lost its connection with God. That is, there is ultimately no evil. Evil is just that part of God that has lost connection. And the way that one reestablishes God, the connection, the things that one does to reestablish the connections by living in a certain way, redeems the pieces of God that have fallen away and bring them back to God. Number 5 is matzah. Matzah is unleavened bread. You can find it in most supermarkets, usually under specialty bread. It looks like, has everybody seen the matzah? Okay, what's it look like?
Looks like a piece of bread or cardboard.
Cardboard, probably. Okay, it's like a giant cracker. It's a flat bread. Nowadays, unlike in the day, probably used by people in Asher Lev, matzahs are made in big bakeries with automated machines, and they're all cut exactly alike. Used to be, of course, matzah was baked by hand, and it looked a little bit different. A chassid is a person who's a member of a Hasidic group. It's a singular. Yiddish is the language of Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe. Yiddish is really a form of German which has had some other words attached to it over the years, especially words from Hebrew, but also words from Slavic languages. Yeah.
Do you speak Yiddish?
Not too well.
Not too
No,
well.
no. I do and I read it, but I don't have too much occasion to speak it. But Yiddish is actually, if you, in its stock words and its grammatical forms, it's a language very close to languages like Dutch and Flemish, or the Swift dialect of German, as opposed to High German. All those languages developed out of medieval German. It's to modern day German and what the language, Middle English, say, some of you have or may look at the Canterbury Tales or something like that. In Middle English, it's the same kind of thing in relation to German. It was the language that when Jews entered Europe that they adopted in the early Middle Ages and used for their own purposes, and wrote it, instead of writing it in Latin characters, they wrote it in Hebrew. That's why it looks strange, but it's really a European language. Ribono Shel Olam is a way of addressing God. It means master of the universe. It is a very common way in the Talmud and post-Talmudic literature that people speak about God. Stalin, of course, had nothing to do with all the previous 8 phrases here. Stalin was, how quickly people forget, who was Joseph Stalin? The dictator of Russia, of the Soviet Union. a man who probably single-handedly over a long period of time was responsible for more human death than even Adolf Hitler, who made Russia into the kind of terrible totalitarian state from which hopefully it is now emerging. But he became the dictator of Russia in the late 20s and extended his control over Russia in the 30s. He was the leader of Russia during the Second World War, and he created this entire police state with its horrible kind of apparatus and so on, in which, you know, all religion was forbidden, and the Hasidim, as well as everybody else who wanted to be who they were, had to go underground. Yeah.
What's the state of Judaism in Russia right now?
Well, like everything else in Russia, it's in a high state of flux. That is, the Russian government has said people can do what they want to do, and Jewish communities in Russia have organized themselves. At the same time, Jews have been trying since the early 60s to get out of the Soviet Union, feeling that regardless of whatever government rules Russia, that their future in Russia is clouded. One of those bad things is that as freedom comes to the Russians, it turns out that there is still residual anti-Semitism in Russia that goes back to the anti-Semitism that existed before the revolution. And so a permanent solution within the Russian state for Jews seems to be almost out of the question. So now that the Russians are allowing free immigration, thousands of Jews are leaving. We just had a new family come here to Tacoma. There are probably, several hundred Jewish Russian families settled in Seattle. Thousands are going to Israel. They're looking for a place to go. They just don't see any future at all in Russia. Even though they have freedom, they feel there's so much hostility historically built into the system that they could never live at peace there. Yeah.
Most Jewish families are like brought into it, you know, to keep going and going in their family. Were you brought into it, or were you Jewish?
Most Jewish people are the children of Jewish parents. That's not so much true in the United States anymore, because in a free society people move back and forth, you know. But it's historically true, and you have to remember that the peculiar fact about Jewish history is that for most of Jewish history, which is a very, very old history, most post-biblical Jewish history, that is, since the destruction in the year 70 of the temple by the Romans, and the creation and movement of Jews all over the world, Jewish communities all over the world, Jews have lived as a minority, often persecuted minority, among a majority. So much of what Jews think of their attitude of the world was built in relation to a world that was hostile. So that being Jewish is not just moving from one church to another, you know, becoming Jewish. It's entering a community which has a very unique and special history.
Were you brought up as a Jew?
Sure. Okay.
What is your background? Where are you from? And how did you become a rabbi?
Well, I grew up in Germany. I was born in Germany.
In Germany?
Yep. And I came to America with my parents right before the Second World War started as a young child. And I grew up in the United States, and I grew up in, I didn't grow up in Brooklyn, I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, which was about as unlike Brooklyn as anybody could ever imagine. And I went through the institutions of the Reform movement, and I went to college, and I went to rabbinical seminary and became a rabbi. Yeah.
You grew up, did you have to have the girls and the...
No, remember that most Jews don't keep that commandment. The idea of payas, why people wear payas, is there is a commandment in the Torah which says one should not cut the corner of one's hair, and that's interpreted as meaning here at the earlocks. Why that rule exists, we don't know, but people, Orthodox people, use payas, they use covering one's head all the time, wearing tzitzis, fringes, as a way of distinguishing Jews from non-Jews. You see, it's a kind of uniform people wear to show who they are, in the same way that a Catholic priest would wear a special collar, you know, or a black suit, or other people who have unique and special beliefs might want to single themselves out in society. Okay. Let's see, Chagall. Marc Chagall was a famous painter. He died not too long ago. Maybe, has anybody seen a Chagall picture? Oh, okay. Here, that's Van Gogh, right, okay. Well, Marc Chagall was born in a little town called Vitebsk in Russia, and he spent most of his life recreating it in different ways. Here's a wonderful example of a village and its people and its animals and its closeness. And he had this wonderful imagination and a wonderful grasp of color, and he put all that work together, and it comes out looking like that. And the Jewish people among whom he grew up, and whose point of view I think must be somewhere inside these paintings too. Well, here's some more, but it's too little to look at. Were Hasidim. That is, Hasidim are people who have a way of looking at the world, just like you and I in America have a way of looking at the world. If one of us were to become a painter, how would we paint the world, right? We would paint it out of our imagination, out of our concepts, and Chagall has a lot of Hasidism in that kind of looking at the world. At the same time, and I think, as you'll notice as you go through My Name is Asher Lev, is that one thing you could say about this book is that it's a book about art and about the relationship of painters to all this stuff, you know, that you've got in this room, to all the tradition of painting that goes before them. That is, could you decide to be a painter tomorrow without knowing any other painter who'd ever painted? If you said, you know, suppose you decided I'm going to be a painter, but I will never go to a museum. I'll never buy one of those books or any of these reproductions. I'll keep my house, all the walls bare. I will never look at another person's work. And I will only be original. Is that possible? No. No. Okay. What would you lose by doing that?
I can't find it, but in the book it says something like, does this book, have you read this book?
A long, long time ago.
Is it like true about most of what they say about the Jews? Because it says in it.
Sure, it's true and it's not true. Like any work of the imagination, it masks reality by creating certain possibilities. You know, it's like saying, suppose in a very traditional Jewish family at a certain point in history, right after the Holocaust, right after the beginning of the State of Israel, when all these emotional things were coming together for Jews, in this very traditional Jewish family, you were to have a child who would grow up to be a famous painter. What would it take for a kid to be a famous painter? I mean, you could write the same novel and you could say, in Puyallup, you know, out here on Meridian someplace, there's a kid walking, and 20 years from now, he's going to be a world-famous painter. How does he get from here to there? And you use your imagination and tell his family story and his education of how he gets to be a person who suddenly has this vision and talent and heart and whatever it takes to be a painter, and puts it all together and creates something, you see? Yeah.
Well, I was going to, like,
Yeah.
he goes and talks to, I forgot who it is, like one of the main people.
Right.
And he's talking to him and he says, we don't find the same beliefs as the second commandment. What are your beliefs on that?
Well, the second commandment says what?
I don't know, that's what I was asking.
Oh, that's a big question. You got to look at the Bible to find out what the second. Thou shalt not make any image of anything, the heaven above, the earth beneath, and the waters under the heaven. That's pretty exclusive terrain not to make an image of. Thou shalt not bow down to it. It's normally seen as the commandment against idolatry, to bow down to images. But for some people, it is much more literal. That is, to make an image. People have, I mean, and traditional Jewish people have had this feeling, but they're not the only ones in the world, that the making of images is, well, there's a terrible photograph someone took, and someone gave me a poster about 15, 20 years ago, which was an ad for a book of photographs someone had taken of Israel. And the photograph on this poster was a bunch of very pious old men with beards, you know, the kind of people you read about in the book, sitting on a bench. And this idiot photographer is taking their pictures, and these people are going like this. They don't want their picture taken. So why wouldn't people want their pictures taken? You see, I mean, what would the smile say? You know, see a camera, you look into the camera, you want to be immortalized. And the idea is that it goes much deeper than just making an image, is that a person is captured by the camera, is captured by the artist. People have very deep feelings about that. But on top of that, in a traditional society like the Hasidic world, even though it produced wonderful painters like Chagall and others who came from these communities, especially at the early part of this century, and went to Paris and studied art and became part of Western art world, the world itself sees that as silly activity for an adult male. Somebody who could be studying Talmud is wasting his time drawing pictures. Why don't you do something serious with your life? It's not too different in a way than if a lot of you came home and told your mothers and fathers, I'm going to be a painter, a famous painter. They would say, well, learn how to be a plumber first. Do something that you can make a living with, that's serious work for a serious human being. We have, you know, a whole set of ideas about artists. We admire them if they're successful. We don't if they're not. We see them as people who are, in a sense, outside the mainstream of life. And that's the feeling you have, plus the fact, as I said, is that the second commandment says you're not supposed to make images, although there have been Jewish painters throughout the centuries. There hasn't been a very, very strong tradition of visual art in Judaism until the 20th century. There are a lot of Jewish painters in the 20th century, but you look in vain to find Jewish painters before that. The whole point, not to give away the end of the book, but the whole point of that is that the problem is, since much of Western tradition of representational art comes out of the church. That is, the earliest pictures we have that are Western were pictures that were painted to be hung in churches. They were altar pieces. They were other kinds of devotional pictures from churches, pictures that were created for people who went to church to look at these pictures and to use them as part of the process of worshiping God. How can Jews adapt some of the images of those pictures with their meaning and use them for their own purpose? And that's a kind of religious puzzle. Rembrandt, of course, was a famous Dutch painter. Rembrandt was, as far as I know, the first Western artist to paint Jews. And there was a large Jewish community in Holland when Rembrandt was painting, and he liked especially to paint not the Jews who were more native to Holland, but the Jews who had moved into Holland from Eastern Europe. And he painted them and found their faces really interesting, and you can, get a volume of Rembrandt's works. In fact, their works simply devoted to Rembrandt's pictures of the Jews that he met in his life, or Rembrandt's pictures of the Bible, which there are many, and all of those deal with how he saw the Jewish people there. So that's interesting. Picasso, again, not necessarily a Jewish name, but Picasso was a man who broke up reality and taught people how to look at it in a different way. Siberia is a part of Russia where if you weren't good, they sent you there. Blasphemous, of course, is a word that deals with language, right? What's blasphemous? Everybody take this test here, or? Yeah, okay.
Going against the word of God or something.
It is, but it's language, you see.
Right.
It is saying something that is at odds with what you should say in terms of religious statements. And therefore it concentrates on words. How do we feel about words? What's the Constitution of the United States say about speech? Right. First Amendment says you have a right to speak. We try to define that. Why do you think there's an idea of blasphemy which comes in almost all major religions, and an idea in the Constitution that people can say what they want to say? How do we feel about talking? What is saying? It's like today we say, "Won't you be my Valentine?" Right? Are you serious? No, you're not serious. How many more traditional societies normally think about speaking as a form of acting, of doing? We say, sticks and stones, right? May break my bones, but names will never hurt me. You ever been hurt by a name? You're a lucky guy then. You must be the only one in this room who never has been hurt by being called a name. People in traditional societies take speech very seriously. The Bible takes speech very seriously. The Jewish tradition takes speech very seriously. You should guard your words. What you say is heard. And therefore, we say you can't be put in jail for what you say, only for what you do. But what they say is it doesn't make any difference because speaking is also doing. Ladover, of course, as you said, is the name of the people. Goy, the Hebrew word is a Hebrew word, also moved into Yiddish. It means, originally it meant nation. In that sense, it meant the world. Eventually it comes to mean everybody but the Jews. It's the same word exactly as the English word Gentile, which comes from the Latin word for nations. In the word goy has most often a sense of hostility. That is, the world is seen as hostile. We in here are safe. They, the goyim out there, are people who one cannot trust. That is the world in which you can get hurt, you can get into trouble, you have to be on your guard. The word kosher applies to Jewish food laws, and It's simply a Hebrew word that means proper. That is, food that has been properly prepared following the traditional Jewish laws of food is kosher food. If you go into a supermarket, you can look at the labels sometimes. I don't know if any of you have, and you see a little circle on it with a U in it. That means that the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations certifies that this is kosher. There are also other symbols, usually variations of a K, that appear in little print on some labels of things, and that's the same kind of guarantee. Okay, shall I go on with these others, or?
Do you all have any questions in particular that you'd like him to address? We've only got 9 more minutes before the bell. And Larry.
About the bar mitzvah.
Okay.
What's the ceremony? What is it? What is the first step to go through bar mitzvah?
Bar mitzvah? Well, bar mitzvah is simply, the phrase itself just literally means son of the commandment, which indicates that the person has reached his majority. Commandment means those rules of Jewish tradition that every adult Jewish person has to keep. So in that sense, it simply means that now you're responsible for your own life. To do that, historically a boy participated in the synagogue service, usually on the Sabbath closest, after first Sabbath after his 13th birthday. In the synagogue on Saturday mornings, we read from the Torah. There's a scroll in the synagogue kept in a special place called the Ark. We read a section from the 5 books of Moses every Sabbath. The boy's called, as people are, to the pulpit. When that's read, he says some blessings, and he usually reads out loud or chants out loud a selection from one of the prophetic books of the Bible, the reading that's assigned to that week. He may do other things. Usually there's a celebration the family has. It's usually a very happy and important event in the family. You know, we have in modern times in Reform and Conservative Judaism, we have an equivalent ceremony for girls where they do the same thing called bat mitzvah. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the Chumash? It says you wrote in it.
Oh, Chumash. Chumash is a word that comes from the Hebrew word for 5. It's simply a printed copy of the 5 books of Moses, of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Yeah.
When you guys go to your Jewish school, do you guys study just Jewish history, or do you study like when Columbus came here and all that crap? I mean,
characterize the entire history of the human race that way.
Do you
Okay.
guys just study your own history, or do you study the?
Well, it depends on what you mean your school. I mean, if you're talking about the people who lived in this community, you know, that you read about, every school, whether it's a Jewish religious school or a Catholic parochial school or a Christian school, has to fill the requirements of the state. So kids who go to these schools in Brooklyn will spend the morning usually studying the Talmud and other Jewish subjects, in the afternoon filling the requirements that the state of New York puts on schools. All Jewish kids in Tacoma simply go to the same schools you go to. In yeshivas, which are, that is where adults go, to learn the Talmud and to be, one of the purposes for going there would be to be ordained as a rabbi. Traditional yeshivas still have the traditional curriculum, that is the Talmud, but the Reform movement and the Conservative movement, and even a couple of the Orthodox yeshivas, have added very different pieces of learning to the curriculum. Yeah.
In your Temple Beth, is that something that we could go visit on a
Sure.
Saturday? I mean, is that a thing that happens there? Or?
Yeah, well, best service probably to come would be Friday evening. We have
What time is that?
8:15 normally, but you check because once in a while we have earlier services for different reasons.
What would happen in a service like that?
Well, it's very much like a church service, except with the obvious differences that we're not Christians, and we use a prayer book, that is a fixed order of worship that's printed in a book, and we pray together, and we have a choir, and we sing, and some things are said, some things are sung. In Reformed congregations, a huge part of the service is in English. If you went to Seattle and visit one of the Orthodox congregations, you'd find most of the service is in Hebrew. So that would be the difference. Oh, yeah.
Do you give a sermon or homily
Sure.
every Friday? And then do you also sing are you a singer?
Am I a singer? No.
No.
No. There are people who are called cantors, and our congregation doesn't have, we have a choir, we don't have a full-time cantor, we're not large enough. We have a part-time cantor who sings twice a month. We want to come one of the weeks, so you'll be here this Friday night. He leads the service with the choir. But the reason he, among other things, is that he knows what he's doing and he has a good voice, which I don't have. Yeah.
What is the symbolism behind, like, it says they like, when they pray, when you guys pray and stuff, it says like they'll rock back and forth and sing the little prayers, you know? And what is the...
Well, symbolically, it's called shackling. And according to tradition, it's the question, an attempt to answer the question, should one bow before God or should one stand straight? And there's a kind of compromise, you keep moving back and forth. But it's really very different because, see, one of the differences you'll notice, say, in a Reformed congregation and a traditional congregation is the style with which people pray. In a traditional style, people are much more aware of their bodies. You know, I don't know if those of you who go to church pay attention to what your bodies do while you're praying. Anybody ever think about that? Some churches you do. In the Catholic Church you kneel, and that's something you do with your body. Most Western religions try to ignore the physical aspects of prayer. But really, chanting and moving does what? If you chant and move, what are you doing?
Burning calories.
Burning calories, good point. Probably not enough to make too much difference. But what are you doing to the content of your prayer? What are you doing to your mood? Once in a while, I'll come to a stop in front of a traffic light, and there's a guy or a woman in front of me, and they're going like that. Some other version of that. You ever seen that? And since I can't hear the music to which they're moving, I have to assume they're radio, or that they're listening to a cassette, to a tape or something, and they're with it, right? They are immersed in their prayers, they're immersed in their music. It's a way of becoming totally part of it. Most of the time when we talk, you know, we just simply stand there, stuff comes out of our mouth, it may not even touch our heads, may not, certainly hard time having it come out of our hearts. To immerse ourselves totally in such an experience is to really feel deeply what we're saying.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.